It's really an honor to be here today to talk about an issue that is, of course, very close to my heart. As a toxicologist, studying the effects of chemicals and pollution on wildlife and human health for many years now has really driven my research and my passion in environmental sciences for a long time. And as you will hear from my presentation, pollution of the global environment is an extremely important, yet perhaps underestimated risk factor in human health. And you will also learn that chemicals produced or discharged locally do not stay local, and their effects may be either immediate or they may be long-term. And however we think about it, pollution is a planetary problem. It knows no borders, no boundaries, and affects all of us. So what is pollution? Pollution has been defined by the Global Commission on Pollution and Health as any material introduced into the environment that is the result of human activity and that endangers human health or the environment. This includes various aspects, including, we've heard a lot about today, ambient air pollution, fine particulate matter, tropospheric ozone pollution, and we've been hearing about air pollution a lot here in London also, and in the UK, as Theresa May recently announced that toxic air pollution is the fourth biggest health risk behind cancer, obesity, and heart disease. And there is increasing evidence that air pollution does not only harm humans, it also harms wildlife and nature. Household air pollution is also, we heard about that today, cooking and heating indoors with solid fuels on open fires. It's still a commonplace practice in many countries and can be deadly. Water pollution, unsafe water sources, inadequate sanitation. Makes me think of a recent trip to China where a Chinese scientist said to me, in China, the water you drink is as dangerous as the air you breathe. Occupational exposures to hazardous chemicals, and this makes us think of exposures to chemicals to workers working in chemical production factories, but also you may think of perhaps more dangerous activities, small-scale activities, such as leather tanneries, textile dyes, lead-acid battery recycling, one of the most dangerous exposures to toxic chemicals. Soil pollution, contaminated mine and industrial sites, ultraviolet and ionizing radiation, and heavy metals. Plastics and microplastics, we heard about them this morning in Professor Jobling's talk. The accumulation of plastic products, either big or small, in our environment, a topic of huge concern. And again, I would urge you to take a look at Dr. Chris Green's poster out at the foyer. And what I'll be talking about a little bit later in my talk is emerging chemical pollutants, endocrine disruptors. So the major drivers of pollution, and we've heard about these as the major drivers of planetary health problems, are urbanization, increasing use of motor vehicles, globalization, relocation of industries to developing countries, increased industrialization, and increasing chemical production all around the world. In this graph, you'll see that the projected growth in chemical production is calculated to be about 3% increase per year in the coming 35 years. This is an increase that will surpass the increase in global populations, which is predicted to level off at some point. We have a current estimation of about 80,000 chemicals on the market, and this is a staggering amount, especially when considering the paucity of information we have on their biological effects, either in humans or in nature. Professor Haynes discussed very briefly this morning the concept of planetary boundaries. I presented them here, a slide I borrowed from the Stockholm Resilience Center. These are the 9 planetary life support systems essential for human survival. And they are being used to quantify just how far we are in terms of global boundaries, global environmental problems. The concept illustrates that our planet has limits, and beyond these boundaries there is a risk of irreversible and abrupt environmental change. We can see that from some of these boundaries, where we see the big red arms, we've actually passed planetary boundaries. This is biodiversity loss, biogeochemical flow boundaries. Interestingly, the boundary for chemical pollution, that's shown up there let's say at 11 o'clock there, has not yet been quantified. The Stockholm Resilience Centre states that emissions of toxic and long-lived substances, such as synthetic organic pollutants, heavy metals, and other radioactive materials, represent some of the key human-driven changes to the planetary environment. They have potentially irreversible effects, but there are too many data gaps as of yet to quantify this boundary. I would personally argue that we may have actually passed this planetary boundary for chemical pollution, or if we haven't passed it, we are certainly very close. In its global burden of disease estimates, the World Health Organization recently calculated that almost a quarter of all global deaths are linked to the environment. This is about 12 million deaths per year. And looking more closely at the sources of these environmental causes of mortality, we find air pollution, water pollution, chemical pollution, radiation, and agricultural practices using pesticides. In fact, the Global Commission on Pollution and Health states that pollution is the world's largest environmental cause of death. And what we perhaps don't realize, that it's not just death by suffocation or other perhaps air pollution or indoor pollution related problems. The role of pollution is in non-communicable diseases. The WHO estimates that of the deaths caused by pollution and environmental factors, 2/3 are non-communicable diseases, including stroke, heart disease, and cancer. I'm going to take a sip here. Sorry about that. So how do these chemicals get into our environment, and how are we exposed? Well, there are multiple ways, one of which is shown here. It was interesting listening to Alex's talk about how actually industrialized countries will bring toxic fuels to developing countries. I mean, that's another way of bringing chemicals across the globe. Here's another way, showing a chemical production factory where chemicals are either discharged through emissions to the atmosphere or discharged through effluents into our water systems or incorporated into consumer products. When incorporated into consumer products, we, of course, are directly exposed to them. And we, once they're in our bodies, we tend to eliminate these toxic chemicals or any chemicals into our sewage treatment facilities. Many of the chemicals are removed by the sewage treatment facilities, but not all are. And they will end up in the treated wastewater, which is either then ending up again in our water systems or deposited on land as biosolids. So here we have this recycling of chemicals that ensures that chemicals are not only produced locally, but are actually distributed throughout the environment and resulting in exposure. Importantly, as I mentioned already, chemicals do not only stay in one place. And when we look at an example here of the persistent organic pollutants, we know that these chemicals can migrate all over the Earth due to global oceanic transport systems, due to long-range air transport. Chemicals that are produced in one side of the Earth can be transported to the other. And so we have chemicals in polar regions thousands of miles away from their original production location. And also the physical chemical characteristics of chemicals allow them to undergo repetitive cycles of deposition and evaporation, moving them all over the Earth. So one of the major concerns about exposure to pollution is exposure during sensitive periods of life. We know that early development, so development of the child during pregnancy, during infancy, and during young childhood are some of the most sensitive periods for the negative effects of chemicals. Because growth is so rapid during these early periods and that basic organ systems are being developed, the prenatal and early developmental period are very sensitive, and exposure to chemicals during these periods may have a greater impact on our health than when we are exposed as adults. In particular, for children living in polluted areas, this may greatly increase their risk for disease. As human development is so exquisitely timed and planned and orchestrated by a group of molecules called hormones, This brings me to a special class of chemicals that we at Brunel have been studying for a long time, the endocrine disruptors, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. An endocrine disruptor has been defined as an exogenous substance or a mixture that alters the function of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse health effects in living organisms or in their offspring. So why are we concerned about these endocrine disrupting chemicals? Well, that's because the endocrine system is such an essential, important system in our body. It controls development and growth. It controls energy metabolism. It controls internal homeostasis and temperature. It controls reproduction, and it controls physiology through the transport of these myriad of hormones from one place to another in the body. So here's an example of various hormones. And we've heard of a lot of them. We know about the estrogens and the androgens, the male and female sex hormones. We know how important insulin is. Insulin is a hormone important in energy metabolism. But think also of the thyroid hormones, really important in brain development and in basal metabolic rates. There are chemical pollutants that affect the endocrine system. They mimic hormones, binding to receptors in cells, inducing cellular responses, or they can block the action of hormones as well. We know that the list of chemicals with potential endocrine disrupting activity is quite long. In fact, over 560 chemicals have been identified with suspected endocrine disrupting activity. And here we see a large variety of them on the screen. They include various herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, industrial chemicals, metals. And the color of the text here on this slide indicates the different hormone systems that the chemicals can disrupt. But it's kind of deceiving because actually these chemicals can have multiple effects and multiple endocrine mechanisms of action. So there are very well documented cases of how endocrine disruption or exposure to these endocrine disruptors has led to changes in wildlife, to adverse effects in wildlife. And so here are some of the examples that are well known. For example, the eggshell thinning of birds, the feminization of birds by DDT and other pesticides. And I was really interested to see this morning, we saw a slide where DDT use, where malaria is increasing all over the world. Well, I still believe that DDT is probably the only effective treatment against malaria, so we can expect DDT use to increase in some countries where there's really no other treatment for malaria. DDT has a number of biological effects and has been banned in many countries for good reason. Other examples include impairment of reproduction and immune function in seals by PCBs and again by DDT. We know of widespread population effects of tributyl-tin. Tributyl-tin is an organotin pesticide that was used as an antifoulant in paints on ships, which led to widespread reductions in populations of snails and other mollusks throughout the globe. And finally, a really important example, an example that came from Brunel actually, is the evidence of widespread sexual disruption by exposure to estrogenic chemicals that mimic female hormones in fish, caused by synthetic estrogens and natural industrial chemicals. So I take a moment to plug Brunel because I wasn't here at the time that this research was done at Brunel, but it certainly was the reason why I got into this field many years ago and why I came to Brunel. The Brunel research actually, through their engagement with policymakers, regulators, and industry, it's been really instrumental in helping find cost-effective ways to manage risk of pollution. And Brunel's research on endocrine disruptors was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize in 2011 and an Order of the British Empire to Professor John Sumter, who unfortunately could not be here today, for this body of work. And if you take a walk along through the campus, you'll see many flags flying in the breeze there, or in the rain, 50 amazing facts about Brunel, and one of the facts is actually that Brunel research has actually changed chemical policy. And not only our research on endocrine disruption in fish, but our research on influencing policy. So there are many cases of endocrine disruption in wildlife, but what about in humans? Well, in humans, it's a bit more difficult to prove. So there is strong evidence for the role of endocrine disruptors in humans, and in particular in a large variety of non-communicable diseases, diseases that are on the rise across the globe, including endocrine cancers, diabetes, and obesity. Effects in humans are hard to study because we need observational studies, and causation is particularly tricky to assign, as these are all really multifactorial diseases that require many years from initiation to manifestation. Nonetheless, this recent UNEP WHO report concludes that the disease risk due to exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals may be significantly underestimated. So if I may, in the last few minutes of my talk, I'm going to move a little bit to my own research that's actually very complementary to some of the research and the information we heard this morning. So I have been working on the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals in obesity. You may have noticed that obesity was one of those non-communicable diseases in the list in my previous slide that's been associated with exposure to chemicals. I wanted to take you on a little journey about how I've come to think about obesity, one of the major global health problems of our time, as a planetary health and pollution issue. So the incidence of obesity and overweight has grown exponentially, and it hasn't escaped any of us, I think. Master of Environment Management student, Marta Plaza Hernandez, she came and asked me if she could help me prepare my presentation, and she has provided me with these beautiful maps that she's made, in which she's used data on the mean BMI, body mass index, of men and women in the last 50 years. So here's a map that Marta created when she looked at the data for 1975. Just to explain, if you don't know, a body mass index of less than 25 kilograms per square meter is considered a healthy weight, between 25 and 30 is overweight, and over 30 is considered obese. In 1975, the US was the only country in the world that had a mean BMI of over 25. So 20 years later, in 1995, significantly more countries have turned red, and 20 years later, in 2014, there are more overweight people in the world than underweight people. And in particular, the rise of childhood obesity is particularly alarming, as it goes hand in hand with the higher risk for a number of diseases later in life. So understanding obesity means understanding the multiple facets of this disorder. Surely there is a genetic component. Surely there is a sociological component. There is a psychological component. But there is also most definitely an environmental component to obesity that you might not have thought about. And this recent commentary in Science suggests that in addition to the two major environmental factors that we all know about, diet and exercise, there are other important environmental exposures that play a role in obesity. These include changes to the microbiome, all of the bacteria in our gut that help digest food, but also a group of risk factors these researchers call other, which includes sleep debt. And again, I was really fascinated this morning to hear that there is a link between climate change and lower sleep, less sleep, because we also think there's a link between less sleep and obesity. Chronic inflammation, but also endocrine disruptors. So increasing number of studies are showing that exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, in particular when the exposure is during sensitive stages of development, increases the susceptibility to put on weight. On the left, this is really a hallmark study done in the United States by Retha Newbold. And in this study, these rats were exposed during development to DES, a synthetic estrogen. And actually, the researchers were quite surprised when they allowed their rats to grow up longer than usual and found that the prenatally exposed animals became a lot heavier than the non-exposed animals. And on the right, you'll see research, a figure from my own work, from my own group, showing that the exposure of mice during development to bisphenol A, a well-known plastics component in plastics packaging of food, causes the animals to develop large fat cells, both in the white and in the brown adipose tissue. So how do we go and study this in humans? Well, this involves various observational studies in which we examine the pre- and postnatal exposure by taking samples of cord blood at birth or samples of breast milk and analyzing the concentrations of these chemicals and following growth and weight gain in children up to 7 years. And in these studies that we've performed, we've actually, we are one of many groups in the world that are starting to find associations between chemical concentrations at birth and increased growth in children up to 7 years of age. These are just 3 examples of publications from my colleagues. So from a planetary health perspective, the huge rise in overweight and obesity represents what Tillman and Clark call in their Nature paper in 2014, the diet, environment, and health trilemma. We have, of course, rising incomes. We've heard about this morning, actually, a lot. Rising incomes and urbanization, driving a global dietary transition where we start to be eating diets higher in refined sugars and fats and oils. This is shown in the top left figure. The green dots are China, the yellow dots are India, the red dots are Europe and North America, where the higher the GDP, the higher the calories, exceeding over 3,000 in some cases on a daily basis, on an average daily basis. The authors calculate that by 2015, these dietary trends, if gone unchecked, will be a major contributor to an estimated 80% increase in global greenhouse gas emissions. In the lower left graph, you can see that if you differentiate the type of diet from an omnivorous diet to a vegetarian diet, it makes a big difference in the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. And these authors have also shown that there is a large reduction in relative disease risk by changing the type of diet. I would argue that there is another dimension to the diet environmental health trilemma, that of exposure to chemicals in food that play a role in obesity. This figure nicely illustrates how chemicals are actually introduced into our food systems, from agricultural practices to the plastics and packaging that they are packaged in, to the global food trade that brings food from one corner of the earth to the other, leading it ultimately to end up on our plates where we are exposed to chemicals. I would argue that we are not only eating more calories of less nutritional content and higher environmental impact, but we are also more highly exposed to chemicals in our diet, which seems to me to be the perfect storm for promoting obesity. So how do we move this field forward? I believe it will be by an integrated and holistic understanding of the environmental causes of obesity. This is a schematic taken from a recent project proposal I've written together with 18 other institutions across the globe. It's called HEROES, Healthy Environments to Prevent Childhood Obesity. And we hope that by understanding and considering the multiple environmental factors, both the individual and the community, the social, the built, the natural environmental factors that play a role in obesity, we can develop the effective strategies, tools, and interventions to promote healthy environments. One of the interventions that we will be testing, or we're proposing to test, are promoting sustainable diets in kids. And we just found out that our proposal made it to stage 2, so we're really, really excited, so fingers crossed. So, in conclusion, I said earlier that I thought we were close to passing the planetary boundary of chemical pollution. I think it's extremely important that we recognize that the contribution of pollution as a risk factor in planetary health. The reason I don't think that we have passed the planetary boundary of chemical pollution is that I hope that we can change this boundary. I hope that it's not, I'm sure it's not too late to push it back. I'm a very hopeful and optimistic person. We have evidence pollution is preventable. Global initiatives to curb chemical emissions, such as the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, have had their successes and led to global reductions in chemical emissions. I only have to look around the room to my colleagues in environment and health who are so dedicated to finding solutions to pollution. These include improved chemical regulation and policy, improved public engagement and awareness of pollution, improved waste and wastewater treatment, improved understanding of natural hazards, clean technology, clean chemistry, green chemistry, improved monitoring and understanding of the fate of chemicals, better understanding of the basic biological mechanisms of health and disease, computational and predictive models that allow us to design better testing strategies for chemicals, reducing the needs for animals. And I just heard that my colleague was successful in a NC3Rs application. That's our major UK platform for alternatives to animal studies. Luigi, congratulations, because you are driving us forward in this predictive toxicology approach without using animals. And ultimately, my own evolution as a researcher examining the holistic and integrated and environmental components of a major human health disease. All these are very exciting interdisciplinary initiatives that call out for more support from a global alliance of forward thinkers like those of you in the audience. And this is why the Planetary Health Initiative has been so incredibly inspirational for me. So let me finish by acknowledging a few people. First of all, Susan Jobling, thank you for your inspirational leadership and for sending me the Lancet Commission report on planetary health just shortly after I arrived at Brunel last year, and for promising to take me to Harvard and then taking me there for the inaugural Planetary Health meeting a few weeks ago in Boston. At Harvard, I was surrounded by inspirational people, including Mary Richards here on the left, and you'll be hearing more from her in a moment. And many thanks to Marta for her help with the presentation, and for all the students and members of the environment and health theme. And finally, many thanks to Brunel University London, who funded this research seminar after I submitted an application over a year ago. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many people who helped today, including Tom Ryan, Anna Little, and Anne Courtney. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you.
Questions for Juliet?
Study prior to the University of West East. Just one question. In that study, did you look at the Caribbean in the hero study? One of the reasons I'm asking that, Trinidad and Tobago has an epidemic of 1 in 5 children are suffering from childhood obesity. And we actually rate 5th in the world per capita pollution. So I just would be interested to find out if there have been any studies done in the Caribbean region with regard to the hero study.
Yes. Thank you for this interesting question. In the hero studies, no, unfortunately, we don't have the Caribbean on board. We have researchers from Australia, Japan, China, and of course many European countries, as it's a European funding. But it'd be very interesting to talk to you more about that. I think that research in the field of pollution and obesity links is just starting. So there's a lot to be done. There's some huge research gaps to fill there, and also to understand how these chemicals have these effects and how they play a role in all of the myriad of factors that lead to disease like obesity. Thank you.
Just to say, by going up down the stairs.
Hi, super interesting, and I hope we can have access to this if possible.
Of course.
I was just wondering, because I've also seen a TED talk about obesity and how it has to do with the balance of oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen intake and I guess output.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you fix that then? Do you think, is it because there's too much CO2, we're inhaling too much CO2 and we're not exhaling enough? Is it because we're not exercising enough? How are we connected more to pollution then?
That's a very interesting question. I wouldn't be able to answer that. I'm not a physiologist. It's something I'd have to think about and come back to, but I think it just shows, we were talking at lunch, the more imagination, the more creativity you use in these types of challenges, the more you can start to link these different issues together and realize they're probably all quite interlinked. So no answer for you yet, but I'm sure when we meet again, I'll have given it some thought and looked into it. Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to flag up the importance of Brunel's research. Obviously, you mentioned John Sumter, and I think it was through the research which Susan and John and others here had actually done on endocrine disruption, which was picked up by the Japanese government. And the reason I flag that is there's obviously a policy need. In the case of Japan, they were very worried about declining sperm counts in Japanese men, and hence they actually paid for John and myself and a few others to actually go out there to try and explore that. That led to a 5-year study exchanging scientists from Japan over to the UK being based here, vice versa. So I think one of the things which we can actually get out of this conference is potentially the opportunity for other governments to recognise the importance of the research at Brunel, and specifically to potentially actually provide funds so that we can actually liaise with them. So I think that's a very good point, so thank you for that.
And thank you for that.
Hi, thank you. One of the most compelling things about the Planetary Health Framework is the sense of urgency it offers, and I think this is an area, from your slide, in which we seem to be overshooting the boundaries. But you seem sort of quite optimistic that there is still hope in this area. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that and why you think, it's good to still be optimistic here.
Yeah, I think I have hope because where there has been action, for example, in the Stockholm Convention of banning or regulating some of the nastiest chemicals that we've had in our environment, that has led to reductions in emissions, and there have been reported cases of in any case of wildlife that have recovered, that have recovered by these reduced levels of some pollutants. So in that way, it is a preventable problem. And if we can get to preventing it, we can get to reducing these pollution emissions, I still believe that there is hope. And I listed a number of ways where we can reduce exposures, where we can influence policy to have better chemical regulation, and where we can have the engineers and the environmental scientists of the future who are designing pollution out of the future products and future facilities and infrastructure. So I hope those are some examples of where I think we haven't passed the boundaries, or if we have, we can still improve.
Mary and then Andrew, and then we're going to move on. Mary and then Andrew.
I think your work is fascinating, and I believe every bit of it. Is there any danger that people will no longer think they're responsible for the growing levels of obesity or how much they eat? They might just think, well, this is all caused by pollution, there's nothing I can do about it, there's no point in exercising. I mean, is there any evidence that suggests that people really just don't feel they're responsible anymore?
I don't think so. I think, obesity is, there's so many different factors involved there in obesity, and I wouldn't pretend to say that the chemical influence on the environmental aspects of obesity play a huge role in it. I wouldn't begin to say that. We know that you can lose weight by dieting and exercise. We know that people feel an individual responsibility for their weight. There's just no way around that. I know from experience. There's no way that people will change that way. I think what we're doing here is changing the mindset a little bit to that all of these years of public health interventions in terms of diet and exercise haven't helped enough. I don't think there's one public health intervention, and perhaps Andy can correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of childhood obesity that has changed this rise in obesity. So obviously there is an environmental, population level, community level factor in obesity that we're missing, that we really need to deal with, and that is also preventable. So no, I'm not taking the burden off the individual. We all are responsible for our own health, but there's this population global factor that the environment plays in it, and I think that's where we haven't been paying enough attention to. Hope that answers your question in a way.
Time for Andy in the front, and then there are more questions around, I know, but if you can turn up the discussion.
I was going to ask you about the prospects for pollution control in this country following Brexit, because the REACH legislation in the EU has arguably been a big step forward. I think it's well respected around the world. And do you see any likely move in this country to downplay or devalue that legislation? If so, what should we in the public health community be doing to preemptively stop that?
Well, that is a very good question, and that's something I've been following with my colleagues very closely and with a lot of interest. There is really a mixed opinion on what will happen after Brexit in terms of European chemical regulation. There are the optimists who will say that this gives the UK an opportunity to reinvent or bring out some of their own unique regulations and chemicals that have actually been quite effective in some areas in the past. May actually be an opportunity for the UK to have even more strict regulations. And there are people that are more negative and would say that this will be an opportunity for the UK to not have to live up to the strict regulations of Europe. So I think I'm still in the middle there. I'm hoping, of course, for the first. I hear a lot of different opinions. I hear that Brexit can be an opportunity, and I hear that Brexit can be very negative. And I think we'll have to see how it works out. We're lucky that we have some excellent researchers here at Brunel who are at the heart of influencing European chemical regulation in terms of endocrine disrupting chemicals. You'll be meeting Professor Kortenkamp in a few minutes, who will be moderating. He's just coming back from a huge workshop on endocrine disrupting chemicals and the future of testing them. So I think we'll have to stay positive there, but we'll have to stay vigilant, because REACH is indeed an amazing step forward for Europe, and we would not be happy if we could not continue at this level of protection.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you.